they used to run numbers, right? You change something and then you have to calculate.
Yeah, all the way down. No, now they're auto something.
Right, and now it's just complex. It's very primitive.
And then Excel somehow beat it.
Yeah, then it was
Oh, yeah.
assimilated
Yeah.
in. I think Microsoft, that's what they did. It's just when they're buying everything.
Yeah, which I always see, like, I see funny memes every once in a while that are like, how is Microsoft Word still what everybody is using? You can't get it to do anything you want it to do. If you want to insert a table in there, it throws off everything. It's like, we can't do this anymore.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
It's so appropriate.
Yeah.
How does anybody work with it?
Yeah.
I can't do it. And I'm kind of in awe of people who can move through it.
Yeah.
It's just easy.
Yeah. One day I was, do you use LinkedIn at all for anything? Okay. So I keep mine updated. And one of the things that they let you.
LinkedIn.
Oh, LinkedIn. Yeah.
Still right.
Yeah. So one of the things that they let you do now is take a skills test. So instead of just saying that you have the skill, you can take the skills test, and it kind of like shows up as a thing with a little bit more credibility. But I started to take the PowerPoint one day because I was like, I can make a good PowerPoint. I'm good at this. It's like, whoa, there is so much more that you can do with PowerPoint that I've never seen before in my whole entire life. So
LinkedIn certificates.
Yeah. I took
PowerPoint. I have a lot of time. I mean, I haven't been in the Microsoft world for it at all.
It's just not what you've used.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel competent enough at PowerPoint. I feel better than other people, say I'm above average, and I don't think that about a lot of things. So
Apple, in that area. Just those sort of basic software applications that like Pages and what is Keynote they have. Keynote is far superior to PowerPoint. I love Keynote.
People have said that, but only Apple people. I've never used it.
And I've even used the Google
Slides.
I even quite like that.
I like Google Slides too. I like it I love all those Google products for class assignments.
I do,
It's so convenient to have a Google Doc that everybody's working on.
It's all been redesigned, rethought. Like, you look at the terrible things in Microsoft with, digital video, editing as well. Like the Hollywood standard is Avid, and this is something that's been around since the early 90s. And it's just been modularized and hacked and all of this to the point where anyone coming in new to it, like when I sit down and have it, I was going to cut this short film over last summer on Avid. I'm like, I just got a license for Avid, and I learned on Avid. And I came back to it, and I was like, what is this? And I was just cursing it. And I was like, this is elitist. And like all of this stuff. It's so
you're complicating
it's the industry standard, but then what it's like it's been so refined, and there's so much. There are other applications that are so much better, but Avid still has the whole, in the whole industry. So that was my criticism of the University of Georgia. They were teaching Avid, and the director I was working with was familiar with Avid. I cannot relearn Avid.
No, I will not.
I will not. Yeah.
Are we waiting on Nicole?
I thought Nicole was going to swing by.
She said she might come in a little bit late. Okay.
So
why don't we just go ahead and get started then. So I seem a little silly just for folks who are going to be seeing recording or doing us through Zoom. So we're pleased to welcome our finalist candidate for the visiting assistant professor of communication studies position, Jessica, who is a PhD candidate in communication studies at the University of Georgia with an emphasis on interpersonal and health communication, in addition to serving as an instructor of research or instructor of record and teaching assistant at Georgia. Jessica Fabbricatore emphasizes communication in media Her research focuses on substance use and abuse, and her current research investigates the labels we place on other substance use and our decisions to disclose that information to others. Presentation is entitled "Is This the Problem? How Labeling a Close Other Substance Abuse Influences Disclosure Decisions." So thank you.
A mouthful, I'm sure. Yeah. I always, with titles, I'm always like, where do I want to go with this? How, because you know how people try to get a little clever, especially with academic journal titles. I don't want to. I just want to tell you what it is. Okay, so thank you for that. And thank you all for coming here today. Like you said, I am a PhD candidate from the University of Georgia. So today I'll be telling you a little bit more about my research in general. Before I get started, just a preview, I'll talk a little bit about me and kind of where I'm coming to this research from. Then I'll talk about this particular study. I'll talk a little bit about the future, what I want to do with research, and then obviously some time for question and answers. So let us get into it. So like I said, very similar. This is my hometown. You can see the remarkable similarities there. So I am from a small town in West Virginia originally. It's not unlike here. It's very similar in a lot of ways, and similar in some not as great ways too. The town and the community in general, the state has had an ongoing epidemic of drug use. Specifically, we've had an opioid problem in the state for quite some time. To give you an idea of how much of a problem it still is, the overdose, it's not funny, but the overdose deaths in the state have decreased 11% in the last year, and the year before that it decreased 4%, but still we are a state with the highest overdose rate. So it is something that has deeply impacted kind of me and where I'm coming to, and this is why I got interested in the area of substance use. I've also always been interested in communication, building relationships, the interpersonal side of things. So I wanted to see how I could kind of merge the two, or at least contribute in some way to improving what was going on in the state, or improving the lives of the people living in my state. So I was teaching for a while. I decided I needed to go back and get my PhD. I wanted to do more research. I wanted to figure out how I could better help people. That ended up being me teaching or researching more about well-being in general. So yes, I went for substance use, substance abuse, and kind of how we're dealing with that. But I've also delved into some parent-child communication research. Most recently, I'm working on a project with my advisor on ACEs, if you all are familiar with that at all, adverse childhood experiences, and how trauma-informed parenting practices might kind of mitigate some of those effects of the adverse childhood events. So that's what I'm working on now. I've also worked on intergenerational transmission of racist attitudes or racist behaviors. I'm also interested in, I'm going to skip real quick. I'm also interested in message effects. So message effects, that research has largely been with another mentor of mine, Dr. Jiaying Liu. We've worked on vaping specifically. So we got a grant through the NIH to explore how to better promote vaping cessation, so quitting vaping, and how to encourage people not to switch over to cigarettes. So we've seen a little bit of that, and we wanted to figure out, is there any kind of messaging? Is there any kind of way we can move away from that? So a lot of my research with message effects has been, extensive literature reviews, trying to figure out what people thought about vaping in the first place. What are our beliefs and attitudes about vaping? This was specifically with young adults. So we looked at high school students and literature from high school and college students. And then we started doing fMRI studies, which was pretty interesting, right? We're doing research on how different messages, whether they're social, meaning, you know, don't vape because your friends won't like you anymore. It's not that, but similar. Or kind of cognitive, meaning you'll get popcorn lung, or popcorn lung is an outcome of vaping. Or emotional, like fear tactics almost. This is scary. This can be bad for your health, and these outcomes are not good. So we wanted to look at those PSAs and see how they might change a person's, you know, actual brain activity. How is that changing the way people are responding to those messages? And then compare them to self-report messages or self-report measures as well. So are those lining up? We are right now in kind of the thick of data analysis and writing papers to kind of look into that a little bit more. So substance use in terms of quitting and not starting anything else. So what I will be talking about today is more of this disclosure decision idea. So in the past, I've done a lot of research about family relationships, how families are impacted by a loved one's substance use. How are we dealing with that? How are we coping with that situation? Are we telling other people? What are we talking about? Because it's stressful for that person. You know, obviously a lot of the concern, a lot of the studies, a lot of the intervention is usually for the person who has a problem with substances, which is great. That is important too. But we know from research that this is having a deep impact on other people as well. So what are we doing about them? So that's where my research started. But then I started getting into my dissertation work, where it's like, what do we do when we haven't quite labeled this as a problem or not? So there's this fine line, right? And I will explain this a little bit more in a second, but there's this fine line where, yes, this person is clearly an alcoholic. This person clearly has an opioid problem, and that's bad. And we know that, and that's stigmatizing, and that's not great. And that is probably going to change the way that we communicate with others about this problem. But what happens when we know that this person drinks, and they may even drink a lot, but it's not a problem. They're going to work, their relationships are fine, or we think they're fine. It's just not something we see as an issue. Are we discussing it differently, or are we willing to talk about it a little bit more or not? And kind of a little bit of my research has looked into why. I'll tell you what I'm presenting here in a minute. All right, so this is generally where I'm at with my research. This is what I've looked into in general. So let me get into my spiel about this particular study. So 58%, animation, 58%, that's the number of individuals 12 and older who have used alcohol, tobacco, or other drugs in the previous 30 days. This is from a couple years ago. There's some questions about this data as far as how we're looking at it, but that is a pretty reliable number. We like this number in most ways. So 58%, more than half of people surveyed have used some sort of substance fairly recently. Alcohol made up the most. And I did look it up in Oregon. That's pretty common. There are several people, whereas West Virginia might be the biggest for overdoses and that kind of issue. Oregon is pretty up there on alcohol, substance use disorders. So this is a problem that you all might be familiar with as well. Alcohol is the most used substance, followed by tobacco and then illicit drugs. 46.3 million people were identified as having a substance use disorder. This number is likely low, right? Because there are a lot of people that don't go get help. They're never actually checked in and registered as someone who has an issue because, again, people like to keep it in their families, deal with it themselves. And 40.7 million people did not receive treatment. Again, probably a slightly low number, but regardless, it is prevalent, it is happening, it is something that is a part of all of our communities. So what does that have to do with today? So this is a picture from a long time ago, but this is, I went to a music festival, with my dad. My dad likes to drink. He's a drinker. Is he an alcoholic? Probably, but it's somewhere along those lines. So again, I was interested in this idea of labeling. So even if we do not use substances, we almost definitely know someone who does. And we probably know someone who is teetering on that line of, is this a problem? Is this not? And I keep on saying problem. When I'm talking about problem, I am talking about perceptions of a problem. So that will be different to different people. You know, my idea of what's too much alcohol or too often of drinking is different than someone else's. But I wanted to look at this. I started down this path when I looked at relationships and family relationships, and I wanted to look more at this idea of labeling. What does that matter, and how's that going to change the way we handle different situations? So the main idea, the main thought behind my research was, does how we label a person's substance use change our disclosure decisions about their use? I was interested primarily in, I call it a close other. You can think of it as a loved one, someone you care about, right? A close friend, a family member, a romantic partner, someone that is important to your life. And label is, again, that perception of a problem. Are we calling it a problem, or are we saying that it is not a problem? And when I say that, not a problem, we're usually not going to come right out. That's not a label that we're going to use all the time. So the idea is, did we label it as a problem, or is there no label? Is it just there? So I was interested in close relationships specifically because of what I was talking about before, because we know that that does have an impact on our own well-being. It can lead to depression. It can have an impact on our life satisfaction, on how we're doing financially. It can have a lot of impact. So I was interested in this idea of close other. And to help wrap our heads around this, I used two different theories. One was the inconsistent nurturing as control theory, and the other was the revelation risk model. And these two theories kind of combine to paint a picture of what we will talk about today. So I'll give you a brief kind of overview of both of these theories, just so we're all on the same page. So inconsistent nurturing as control basically asks, is substance use labeled as problematic or not? This theory in particular was interested in initially marriages. So they're interested in romantic partners. And basically this says that at first you're going to say that it's not a problem. You know, whatever they're doing, probably not an issue. If you want to get a drink, that's fine. You get a drink because everything is normal. The partner may participate in the behavior as well. We're drinking together. We're having fun together. We go out to a brewery. We do all the things. And that's where it started. And then it says that eventually what happens is usually there's some kind of triggering event. And the triggering event leads us to label the problem as problematic, the substance use is problematic. And from there, within the couple, what happens is you kind of get really angry, right? And you start to say, you can't do this. You try to restrict access to substances. You yell, you do all the things. And then it would go on to say that sometimes after that, you keep yo-yoing back and forth. After your post-frustration phase, you're just like, I can't control this. So sometimes you're a little bit nurturing and you try to help the person. I feel so bad for you. Let me help you get through this. And then you go back to this idea of, I'm just angry. Why do you keep on doing this? Why do you keep messing up? So the idea of a problematic label is usually triggered by this negative event. And it ultimately just changes your reaction to the person using substances in general. So this theory is more about your relationship with the other person and the communication within the relationship. But I thought, well, if it's changing the relationship or the communication within the relationship, it's likely changing kind of your attitude in general. If you're unhappy in your relationship, if there's turmoil in your relationship, it's probably impacting how you talk to other people as well. So that's kind of the basis of this theory and kind of how I'm using it. And then we have the risk or the revelation risk model, which says that we assess and whether information is risky to reveal, which determines our willingness to disclose information. So this is used in several contexts, but basically, again, the idea is this positive or negative information? Based on my assessment of whether it's positive or negative, do I think it's risky or not? And if I think it's risky, the model says, or the theory says that I'm not going to tell information that I think is risky. I'm not going to tell more negative information because it is more risky. So therefore, yeah, I'm not going to disclose it. But if I don't perceive it as negative, I'm probably not going to perceive it as risky. And therefore, I might be more willing to talk about it. So that's the gist of this theory. And here we're talking for risk, we're talking about a few different types of risk. Again, this theory originally was made for revelation about yourself. You know, do I think it's risky information to tell you all something in this interview that is, you know, that something. So based on that, am I willing to disclose? I was interested in if the same can kind of be applied if it's information about someone else. So that was a part of this too that I was interested in exploring further, and in certain parts of my dissertation I do. Not what I'm talking about specifically today. But risk involves self-protection, relationship protection, and other protection, where self-protection is this going to hurt me, my reputation? Is this going to lead to ridicule and all these things? Relationship protection is between me and the person I'm telling. So is this going to damage my relationship with Ben? Am I going to are they going to judge me? Am I going to feel less good about what's going on here? And then a particular interest to me in some of the analyses is this other protection. And other protection would, in my case, refer to the other person. Am I worried that revealing this information is going to somehow impact the other person negatively? So we have 3 types of risk, usually measured all together. And then another important term from this model that you need to know is information valence. So information valence is just what your perception is. Is the information positive or negative? That's all valence is. Is it positive or negative? Do I think it's good or bad? So these 2 words or these 2 terms are key to understanding how I'm going to talk about the rest of this, and we'll move on from there. So do not get overwhelmed. It's not too bad. This is a little model and I will break it down. So here's the model that I am working with. It's called a serial mediation model, which just says that this X is going to go through these two mediators to predict Y, which means that this is also going to influence the outcome. This is going to influence the outcome. This is the outcome. So the prediction here is that one, substance use labeling it as problematic is going to be negatively related to valence. And it's negatively related because the way I scored this was that substance use, a higher score means more problematic, and then valence, a lower score means more negative. So it's negative in that when more problematic, more negative, or less positive is a better way to put that. And then when valence is low, when valence is more negative, then risk is higher, right? So negative relationship. And then when risk is higher, we are less willing to disclose. Yeah? All right, so that's the gist, but anytime you do a serial mediation model, which is what this is, you also want to test these interactions just to see what's happening, just to make sure. So we also want to say that this same relationship, if we more problematic, more or less positive, and then will lead to less willingness to disclose. So negative valence, less willing to disclose. And then if a substance is labeled as problematic, it's going to be perceived as more risky, and then you're going to be less willing to disclose. So we want to look at all of that. To do this, I'm going to go quickly through methods, but I am happy to come back to this. So for participants, we ended up with an N meaning number of participants, 467. It's actually higher now. It ended up being closer to 600 the last time I checked. Just wanted to make sure that this was right. So of those participants, they were closer to 20 years old, but the range was pretty high. In case you were wondering, because some people do, the median age was 19. So that 69-year-old or a couple of the people who are a little bit older pulled the mean up a little bit, but not too much. Mostly female, mostly white. For close others, they were 29 years old, mostly, or close to 29 years old. You see a high range there, but actually 29 years old ended up being the median as well. So it didn't pull it up any, that's just where we were. You'll notice the difference here. Most of the people they reported on were male, but still mostly white. And these people that they reported on, the close others that they reported on, mostly used alcohol and marijuana. The people who used illicit drugs or more illegal drugs, were a very small percentage. It was 7% of the sample used illicit drugs. This is something that I would be interested in exploring further later. But this is what we're working with. And then if you're interested, when I asked them who they were reporting on, most of the people did report on a friend followed by a family member, so a parent or a sibling, a couple people, there were children in there, or extended family like aunts and uncles. And then a few sprinkled in there, roommates, and one person in particular put, well, we were together and then we weren't anymore and we got a divorce, but now we're close again. I said, probably could have picked some relationship there, so just one. Yeah, right. But if they felt the need to do something, they felt the need to specify, and that's fine. And most of them had talked to people in the last 24 hours. And then when you look at, in the last week or the last 2 weeks, that number increased to like 96%. So a very high number of people are actually talking to this close other. They're not just saying that they're close. They are close. When you look at these participants answered questions about those 4 main variables that I discussed a second ago. So we looked at things like substance use, where that blank, the way I made the surveys, included the person's name. So they typed in the name at the beginning and it would have their name there. So substance use problematic, yes or no. For here, we had knowing about their substance use is extremely negative to extremely positive. For risk, it included those 3 sections that I talked about, so self, relationship, and other, and these were sample items. And willingness to disclose, again, this had 19 items, but they were similar to this, where would you tell someone else if you thought that it was going to help them, if it was relevant to the conversation. Those were the kinds of questions that were asked there. So these were the main questions we asked, and based on those answers, here's what we got. So first, that negative relationship was there, and it was significant. So we saw this significant relationship. That's good. That's what we wanted. We saw no significant relationship here. It was close for those of you who are stats people. 0.05 is what we consider statistically significant. 0.06 is kind of getting there, although I don't like it when people say that. But risk to willingness to disclose was also very significant at 8.001. And some people like these numbers. So direct effect means like if you're just looking at this association, what happened, it was not significant. But when you add in these mediators, it was significant. So that is what you would expect. To look at these indirect results, valence just wasn't doing what it needed to do. So valence was the variable that wasn't working, and that's something I'm working through. But this relationship was significant. So we do see that problematic substance use label meant more risk, which led to less willingness to disclose. So what does all this mean? Because I just showed you the model, right? So to sum it up as best and as concisely as possible, labeling does change the way you are going to handle the situation. If you label something as problematic, you are less likely to disclose that information than if you are not labeling it as problematic. People are less willing, yes, to disclose information when the close other substance use is labeled as problematic, and this was completely mediated by valence and risk, which means, again, that direct association wasn't there until we added in the mediators. Whether the information is good or bad might not always change the perceptions about the risk. So this is that valence variable. This is what I'm unsure of, and that I'll come back to a little bit when I talk about limitations. But essentially, just because I label it as problematic, just because I think that it is not good maybe for their health, or because I'm concerned about that person's substance use, does not necessarily mean that I think that substance use is negative, or their substance use is always bad, which is an interesting kind of, why not? Why would you not think it's bad if you've labeled it as a problem? But that's just not what was popping up. So we see that was an interesting thing that popped up from all of this. People take the self, relationship, and others into account when they're discussing whether or not they're willing to disclose, or when they're thinking about whether or not they're willing to disclose. This is interesting. The way this particular measure works is one scale, one measure. So they all kind of combine onto each other. One thing that I'm interested in doing further is to see one of these can be standalone scales, see if I can measure each by themselves. And if I can, does it change? Is that changing the way these labels are working or your willingness to disclose? Because I imagine, right, if you're more worried about yourself, that might act a little bit differently in a conversation than if you're worried about another person. If you're worried about another person and protecting the other person, but maybe you don't think that they're ever going to find out, then how does that change anything, right? So we take these things into account. And so back to the idea of labeling, and back to the idea of how we're going to react to substance use when we think it's a problem. People are not only changing their behavior within the relationship, they're not only saying, well, now I'm mad at you and now we don't have a good relationship. It's also changing maybe how we communicate with others. So what would be interesting here to me is to continue this, to see if it does change even not only willingness to disclose this particular topic, but your willingness to engage in conversations in general, your willingness to disclose any kind of information with people. Does it make you more standoffish? Is basically what I'm interested in. Once you learn that there's something kind of negative happening, where does that lead you in disclosure decisions? So the two major limitations here, although there were others, were that the sample reported on mostly friends and mostly reported on legal or like nearly legal drugs. So how does it change, if at all, when we're looking at opioids, when we're looking at heroin and meth and other things that, that's pretty stigmatizing, and that's pretty also pretty detrimental. It can ruin a person's life very quickly in a different way. And then measures. So for the risk or the revelation risk model, the authors, even I reached out to them, they're like, yeah, we don't have the measures that we're willing to share with you. So I had to piece together what they had published and what other people had published to work with a scale. I did find something. I found some things that made a lot of sense, and I checked. It's a reliable scale as far as it all loads onto what it's supposed to load onto, but it is interesting. I would like to work with this measure a little bit more to see what we're doing. So those are two major limitations. In future directions, like I said, there are a lot of different avenues. One of the things that I want to do is look at different disclosure strategies. So that's the other part of my dissertation that I have not presented today. I just talked about willingness to disclose, but there are also, how are you going to disclose? Are you going to talk incrementally, like, oh, Stephen was drinking, and then their reaction to that will determine whether I tell more if I say more, or is it a direct disclosure, or how are we talking about this? So disclosure strategies, and then the risk types, like I said, self, others, and relationship. But I do want to investigate the more broad concept of how are we talking about other people's private information? And maybe you all have a suggestion, but I'm not talking about gossip. It feels a lot different, right? When you're casually talking about, you know, here's an update about my mom, here's an update about other people in my life. That's not gossip, but it's not necessarily disclosing some secret either. It's not a secret. So where is that line and what is that word? I don't have the language for what that is. And I'm interested in kind of trying to develop that. And then looking forward, I'll wrap it up. Looking forward, so I want to publish this dissertation work, and I want to continue my work on ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. That's, I mean, it's something newer to me, but it is something that is relevant. I think it's something that is interesting and has the potential to really inform intervention, which is something that I ultimately want to start working more with, is a more practical application, getting out of theory and into practice. From that, I do like the idea of developing more of a campaign or intervention for support for those people, for people that are dealing with a loved one's substance use, and maybe see how social media might be integrated into all of this. And then as a side project, something that I've been interested in and I would like to do in general is begin kind of a research area in instructional communication, which some people call it educational psychology, but in general, just how to be a better teacher and how to improve teaching practices. So that's something that a side project or an area that kind of differs from what I usually do that I'd be interested in getting more into. So thank you. I wanted to end with a picture that was pretty much the same as my other one. All right, thank you.
Jess, thank you so much for sharing. I know we're a smaller group. A lot of people are kind of in and out at the end of the term, but we really appreciate it. We'll have some folks who will have the chance to see your recording and research, so we really appreciate you sharing. Do want to open things up, but I do want to start with a question. So in your findings, I was particularly interested in the relationship you were finding between the substance use label as problematic relative to a willingness to disclose and share information. Yeah. And I think that a body of literature, well, and risk as well, right? So a body of literature that I found really interesting, I was thinking about this as you were sharing, is stigma management communication. Right? So yes. Box were theorizing different strategies of disclosure, strategic management of stigma. And as you're kind of discussing in your findings and results, right, a lot of this seems to be almost secondhand stigma, right? The impact of disclosure of stigma or potentially stigmatizing labels, you know, discussing alcohol, drug use with others, with the implication that you, by being associated with this person, are experiencing some degree of stigmatization. Yeah. I'm also thinking about this in the context of communication privacy management theory and the development of this shared set of guidelines that govern how that information is described. And I'm curious, where do you see kind of stigma management communication fitting into the use of substance abuse labels and the sort of negative valence assigned to those labels? Yeah, okay. So that's something that I've worked with a little bit in other projects and something that I've thought a lot about here. Corrigan talked about stigma by association, right? And talked about it a lot with mental illness or substance use issues. So for this particular project, I was interested in that idea of label or not label, right? If you've labeled it, I didn't measure stigma specifically because I wanted to test this model, is what I wanted to test the revelation risk model that hasn't been used a ton. So I stuck with the model and what we were working with, but stigma is certainly a part of a lot of these measures, especially risk. So how is this going to negatively impact
me, my relationships, how people think of me, and what people are going to do. When I'm writing up my discussion, that's certainly going to be a big part of it, because my assumption, to some degree, is that because you've not labeled it as a problem, you might not see it as stigmatizing. And that is something that, in full disclosure, I wish I would have added in there as a measure, but it's still something that I can integrate into here, certainly, because stigma is such a big part of it. And then the revelation risk model actually was kind of developed partially from communication privacy management. So it was a more testable way to look at how we are dealing with private information in general. Yeah, so stigma, huge part of this is my gut reaction, and the way I measured that was kind of through risk.
Yeah, I mean, and thinking about the social media climate, I would say through outlets like TikTok, the more open disclosure, and algorithmically targeted, mental health, stigma, substance abuse related content, I think is an interesting avenue. And, the landscape of what is considered stigmatizing or risky is not the same. So
yeah, well, and that's, so even, for me and this research, making sure that I'm using the right words, right? A lot of people say we don't say addict, we don't say addicted even. Substance use disorder is preferred over substance abuse in a lot of realms. So, I mean, for me in the research, how I write about my research, I'm very deliberate about how I'm talking about it. And the way that I develop my surveys, I also am very careful about my wording so that I'm not placing a negative connotation on it before they even get started. I don't want to make that assumption that they think it's negative. I want that to come out by itself if possible.
Sure. Thank you for that. That helps me to reassess, the very kind of instinctual language choice versus a more intentional way and how those labels came.
Yeah, of course. Sure. Yeah.
So I'm not from communications, but I understand the gist of what's going on here. I wonder if talking about someone's being labeled.
Yeah.
So maybe you have a habit, or maybe you have a tradition, but now we've decided it's a problem. Is there a way to control for or understand how that's affected by the person applying the labels? Which is to say, if I am a recovering alcoholic and I say you have a problem, do I come into it with some kind of
nuance,
greater authority, or does that change the dynamic at all?
When you're looking at this inconsistent nurturing as control, there was one study in particular that looked at co-users, so both people using and someone who was trying to be in recovery. You see the same pattern, which is kind of interesting. And I think a lot of it is just human emotions. Like, you might understand, you have that lived experience, so you understand what you're going through, but it doesn't stop you from getting frustrated and being like, I just wish this was different. I want this to feel better. I want this relationship to be better. So it was interesting to me when I read that it didn't change that much. But there is a little bit more trying, it seemed like. That was a qualitative study, so it was more trying to understand and empathize, but almost more frustration, if I'm remembering correctly, more frustration because they've done it and they've been through it. So they're like, well, if I can do it, why can't you?
More frustration on the part of the labeler.
Yeah, yeah. And a big part of this theory is that, so what happens is the labeler is, and they have really problematic, in my opinion, a way to label this is like a functional partner and the I don't know, the compromised partner or something weird that is like, I'm not using that. But so the labeler tends to go through that cycle of trying to help and then trying not to help. And the idea of the theory is that the labelee takes that and kind of enjoys that nurturing time, right? And really appreciates so the idea of the theory is that it's actually kind of the labeler's fault that they keep on using substances.
Labeler.
Yeah, exactly. That's the idea, is that you are enabling because you're helping, and even when you get mad, you're getting mad out of love or something like that, and the person likes that. They like the attention, or they like, and the theory would say that the labelee is actually the person in control, that they're the person that is kind of pulling the strings and making things happen. It's pretty interesting, although when it was developed with this very one-track mind of a husband and wife, where the husband is going to work and drinking, and the wife is kind of a homemaker relying on the husband for income as well. So it's a very interesting development of the theory. I am more interested in the idea of the theory rather than kind of some of those major assumptions that it made.
I'll just say thank you.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
That was great.
I enjoyed it. John, do you have any questions?
No.
Okay. Sorry. I do that in my classes, and sometimes they're like, I wish you didn't.
That happens, yeah.
Yeah.
You're not always sure.
Yeah.
Something they're gonna say or
Yeah.
something else.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I would just say, it's very engaged to see this relationship between the interpersonal elements of health disclosure decisions and substance use and the ways in which that's applied. That I think are incredibly relevant, interpersonal, health, sort of the social media and kind of wide direction that you see yourself taking it. And I'm curious to see where you'll be able to take that further.
Yeah. Like I said, I'm really excited about the idea of intervention, the idea of okay, we know this information now, so what can we do with it? How can we make this better? Yeah,
it also occurs to me, right? So, coming from disability studies scholarship, there's a lot of discussion of sort of substance use or of a label being kind of monolithic, right? So, for instance, I've talked to neurodivergent, autistic folks in the doctor's office, and their encounter is, well, if I disclose that I'm autistic, that's the only thing that I'm allowed to have. That's the only thing the doctor cares about,
right? Not
about any of the other things. So I'm curious, what do we make then of overlap with regard to substance use in cases where there are multiple substances in play? I'm wondering what that disclosure and secondhand disclosure might look like in navigating where it's multiple aspects of perhaps someone's use that need to be disclosed.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I think that I want to capture if I collect data like this again, because they're mostly alcohol and people who smoke marijuana, and those are two things that are relatively accepted by society. It's something that if I say that I have a parent who's an alcoholic, a lot of people are like, oh, me too. But if I say that I have a parent who, does meth, then that feels different. It's probably not as many people can relate. So it might be kind of a relatability kind of thing going on there too. So how do we know what's happening?
Well, and it's such a patchwork now because, of course, like state law is not necessarily going to match public opinion, but state law has changed so much, and Oregon is kind of on the very strong end of decriminalization in a lot of cases. So it'd be interesting to see how factors such as state and region surrounding some of those disclosure decisions, considering legality in the state.
Yeah.
As you're, approaching other substances.
Yeah, and I mean, another thing that I didn't talk about here, but if it was I don't know, I have a lot of ideas, but one of the things that I'm also interested in, kind of like you were talking about, is, if I go to the doctor, do I disclose this to my doctor? Do I tell them that I ever had a problem with substances? Or is that going to be the only thing that they think about now? And, I have friends that will go to the doctor and they're like, I don't want pain medicine. Don't give me pills. And they won't say why. And a lot of times, at least in West Virginia, they're not going to ask why. They're just going to say, okay. And I don't know if that's a product of the environment and what is happening, or if it's standard procedure. But, even little things like that, not probing too much. Is that good? Is it bad? How's it help or hurt? So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, I had fun. I appreciate it. Oh, do you want me to?
Are you doing a tour now? Did I get that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Where you'll be.
I'm going to end this.
Oh yeah.
Or do you want to
Still
talk?
got the dual screen, so
Okay.
yeah, go ahead and